name is Marcus Webb, and I work as a technical support specialist for a software company called Viridian Systems. I've held this position for 6 years. My job involves answering phone calls from customers who are experiencing problems with our enterprise resource planning software, diagnosing issues, walking clients through solutions, and escalating complex problems to our development team. I work in a call center environment, which means I sit at a desk in a large open space with dozens of other technical support specialists, all of us wearing headsets, all of us managing calls simultaneously. My personal habit is that at the beginning of every shift, I write down 3 things I want to accomplish that day in a small notebook I keep in my desk drawer. I've done this for the entire 6 years I've worked here. It centers me. It gives me a sense of purpose before the calls start coming in. My emotional weakness is that I need people to like me. If I'm perceived as difficult or incompetent or unhelpful, if a customer becomes frustrated with me, if a colleague thinks negatively of me, it creates an anxiety that I struggle to manage. I try very hard to be the kind of person people want to work with, and my logical belief, the thing I was absolutely certain about until this evening, was that the places where we work are fundamentally safe, that office buildings have security systems, that there are fire exits and emergency protocols, that if something dangerous happened, there would be procedures in place to protect us, that we would be able to leave if we needed to. It's 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in late October, and I'm writing this account in my car in the parking lot of the Viridian Systems building located on the north side of town. I'm writing this while I wait for help to arrive, while I try to process what has happened over the past 4 hours, while I try to make sense of a situation that doesn't fit into any logical framework I've developed in my 38 years of life. I'm going to tell you what happened starting from the beginning of my shift, which was at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I arrived at the office at 1:45 p.m. to give myself time to settle in before my 2 o'clock start time. I went through my standard routine. I made a cup of coffee in the break room. I checked my email. I opened my notebook and wrote down 3 things I wanted to accomplish during my shift. Today, those 3 things were: 1, reduce my average call handle time to under 7 minutes. 2, complete the training module on the new software update. And 3, maintain a customer satisfaction rating above 90%. These are realistic goals. I've achieved these goals consistently over my 6 years here. I sat down at my desk, put on my headset, and logged into the phone system at 1:58 p.m. The calls started coming in almost immediately. That's normal for a Tuesday afternoon. People are dealing with issues that accumulated during their morning and early afternoon, and they're reaching out to technical support to try to resolve them before end of business. I spent the afternoon taking calls, troubleshooting problems, documenting solutions. My day was proceeding normally. My handle time was tracking well. My customer satisfaction scores were good, and everything was exactly as I expected it to be. Around 4:30 p.m., I became aware of a change in the office environment. There was a kind of alertness that wasn't typical. People seemed to be talking to each other more than usual. I noticed my colleague, Jennifer, at the desk next to mine, standing up and looking toward the front of the office. I asked her what was happening. She said she wasn't sure, but she'd heard something about an incident somewhere in the city. An incident of some kind. I didn't pursue the matter further. I logged back into the phone system and continued taking calls. But around 5 p.m., there was an announcement over the office public address system. It was our office manager, a woman named Patricia, who handles facility management and administrative issues. She said there was a situation developing in the city. Aren't you that there had been reports of some kind of disturbance, and that the building was going to initiate its emergency lockdown procedures as a precautionary measure? She said this was not a drill, that all employees should remain at their desks, that all exterior doors and exits would be locked, and that we should wait for further instructions. I remember processing this announcement and feeling confused by it. An emergency lockdown seemed excessive for an unspecified incident somewhere in the city. I looked around the office to see how other people were responding. Some people seemed concerned. Some people seemed to be taking it in stride. Some people seemed barely to have noticed. I decided that the situation was probably being managed appropriately, that the lockdown was a precaution, and that I should return to my work. I logged back into the phone system and continued taking calls. But now there was a different energy in the office. People were distracted. Calls were being missed. I could hear conversations between colleagues becoming less work-related and more focused on what was happening outside. I continued working because that was what my job required. I had goals to achieve. I had customers waiting for help. Around 5:45 p.m., my shift was supposed to end. Our shifts run from 2 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. with an additional 15-minute buffer for logging out of the system and wrapping up any remaining work. I started the wrap-up process. I logged out of the phone system. I began shutting down my computer. I started gathering my personal belongings. But as I was doing this, I realized that the office seemed different. It was quieter than it should be for 5:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. Usually at this time, there's a transition as the evening shift comes in and the afternoon shift leaves. There should be people coming and going from the elevators, people saying goodbye to each other, people heading toward the exits. But the elevators weren't moving, and there were no people heading toward the exits. And Patricia's voice came back over the public address system at 5:52 p.m., and she said that the emergency lockdown was still in effect, that all exterior doors and exits remained locked, and that we should remain at our desks until we received further instructions. I felt a small spike of anxiety at this announcement. The lockdown was still ongoing. I couldn't leave. I was going to have to stay in the office longer than my scheduled shift. This wasn't the end of the world, but it was disruptive to my evening plans. I had plans to go home, have dinner, get some rest. Now I was going to have to wait. I asked Jennifer if she knew what was happening. She was still at her desk, and she said she'd been checking the news on her phone. She said there were reports of some kind of attack happening in various locations around the city. She said the reports were vague, but they mentioned violence, incidents, people behaving in ways that police were describing as extremely dangerous. She said the details were unclear, but it seemed serious enough that the building management had decided to lock down. I asked her if she thought we would be let out soon. She said she didn't know. She said it depended on when the situation outside was resolved. I felt my anxiety increasing slightly. I didn't like the uncertainty. I didn't like not knowing when I would be able to leave. I tried to focus on my breathing and to remind myself that this was probably a temporary situation, that it would be resolved, and that I would be able to leave eventually. The next hour passed slowly. Most of the afternoon shift staff remained at their desks or in the building. Some people tried to work on other tasks. Some people sat at their desks doing nothing. Some people gathered in small groups and talked about what might be happening outside. I tried to read email, but I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the situation outside the building, about the reports of violence and attacks, about the lockdown and when it might end. Around 7 p.m., there was another announcement. Patricia said that the situation outside was continuing to develop. That police had advised the building management to maintain the lockdown until the immediate area was cleared of danger, and that we should plan to remain in the building through the evening. She said the building had adequate supplies, that there was food and water available, and that we should make ourselves as comfortable as possible while we waited. The realization hit me then that I wasn't leaving today. I was going to be spending the night in this office building. This wasn't an emergency situation in the immediate sense. There wasn't an active threat inside the building. But there was something happening outside that was serious enough that the building management and the police had decided we needed to be locked in for the night. I walked to the front of the office space and looked out the windows. It was dark outside now. But the street lights were on. I could see the parking lot and the surrounding area. Everything looked normal. There was nothing visibly wrong. There were no obvious signs of danger. But there was a kind of stillness to the area that felt unusual, a lack of activity that suggested people were being cautious or avoiding the area. I returned to my desk and tried to decide what to do. I sent a text message to my wife, Rebecca, telling her that I was going to be locked in the building overnight due to some kind of incident in the city. She replied almost immediately, asking if I was safe, if I needed her to pick me up, if there was anything she could do. I told her I was safe, that there was no immediate danger inside the building, and that I would probably just spend the night here and leave in the morning when the lockdown ended. Or she said she would monitor the news and would be thinking of me. By 8 p.m., most of the afternoon shift staff had settled into some kind of acceptance of the situation. People were sitting at their desks, using their phones to check the news, talking to each other about what was happening outside. I was doing the same thing. I was scrolling through news sites on my phone, trying to understand what was happening in the city. The reports were becoming clearer. There had been what was being described as an outbreak of some kind. People were becoming violent, were attacking others, were spreading some kind of infection or disease. The reports were calling it a zombie-like condition, though the news anchors were using careful language to avoid sounding sensational. There was uncertainty about what was actually happening, and the authorities were asking people to remain indoors and to avoid contact with infected individuals. The National Guard was being mobilized. It was clearly serious. But it was also happening somewhere else in the city, not at this office building. The building was in a secure location, and the situation was being contained outside. I felt reassured by this. Yes, I was locked in the building overnight. Yes, there was something dangerous happening outside, but I was safe. The building was secure. The situation would be resolved by morning. Around 9 p.m., our office manager, Patricia, gathered everyone who was still in the building in the main conference room. There were about 30 of us. Patricia said that the building security and the police had advised that the lockdown would definitely extend through the night, whereas that they didn't expect to be able to clear the immediate area until at least dawn, and that we should settle in for a long evening. She said the building had supplies, food, water, blankets, that we could use to make ourselves comfortable. She said there were meeting rooms and offices where people could rest if they wanted to. She said the security team would remain on alert throughout the night, and that if there was any change in the situation, we would be notified immediately. Patricia seemed calm and professional. She gave the impression of someone who had a situation under control. This reassured me. I felt like the building management knew what they were doing. I felt like we were being well managed through this crisis. Most of the people in the conference room seemed to feel the same way. There was a kind of camaraderie that developed among us. We were all in the same situation. We were all going to spend the night here together. People started talking about making the best of it, about finding a place to sleep, about keeping each other company through the night. Around 10 p.m., I was sitting with Jennifer and a few other colleagues in the break room, and I mentioned that I was starting to feel tired. Jennifer said she was too, and she suggested we find a place to sleep. She said she was going to use one of the meeting rooms on the second floor. I decided to do the same. I followed her up the stairs to the second floor, found an empty meeting room, and lay down on the long conference table using my jacket as a pillow. I was actually able to sleep for a couple of hours. I woke up around midnight and checked my phone, which is there were news alerts about the situation continuing outside. There were reports of the National Guard establishing perimeters around affected areas. There were reports of hospitals being overwhelmed. But I was secure in the office building. I was safe. I closed my eyes and went back to sleep. I woke again around 2 a.m. I felt disoriented, which is normal when you wake up in an unusual place at an unusual time. It took me a moment to remember where I was and why I was here. I was in the office building. I was locked in because of the outbreak situation happening outside. I went to the bathroom, drank some water from the break room, and then decided to go back to sleep. But I couldn't sleep. My mind was active. I was thinking about the situation outside, about what was happening in the city, about when I would be able to leave. He said about whether my wife was safe at home, about whether I should have tried to get home before the lockdown was implemented. These thoughts were cycling through my mind, and I couldn't quiet them. Around 3 a.m., I decided to stop trying to sleep and instead to explore the building. I walked through the office spaces, looking at the desks where I'd been working earlier in the day. Everything looked normal in the darkness. I went to the windows and looked outside. The parking lot was still lit by streetlights. The surrounding area was still quiet. There were no obvious signs of danger, but there was something about the quality of the silence that was unsettling. It was a profound silence, the kind you get when there's no traffic, no people moving around, no normal urban activity. It was the silence of a city that had stopped. I decided to check the security office to see if there was any update on the lockdown status. I found the security office on the first floor near the main entrance. There was a security guard there, a man named David, who I'd seen around the building before. He looked tired, like he'd been awake all night. I asked him if he had any update on when the lockdown might end. He said the police had advised that the lockdown would remain in effect until dawn and that they would reassess the situation at that time. He said there had been some activity in the area outside the building earlier in the evening, but things had been quiet for the past couple of hours. He said they expected the situation to be resolved by morning. I asked him what kind of activity he was referring to. He hesitated for a moment, and then he said there had been some people moving through the parking lot earlier, people who seemed to be behaving erratically. He said the police had been contacted and they had responded, and now things were quiet. He said I shouldn't worry, that the building was secure and that we were all safe. His reassurance was somewhat comforting, but there was also something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely certain about what he was saying. There was a quality of attempting to maintain calm rather than actual calm. I thanked him and returned to the office spaces. I spent the next few hours sitting at my desk, occasionally checking my phone for news updates. The situation in the city was continuing. There were reports of military presence in various locations. There were reports of safe zones being established, or there were reports of the infection or the outbreak or whatever was happening continuing to spread, but slowly, and being contained to certain areas of the city. Our building's area seemed to be stable. Around 6 a.m., I began to anticipate that the lockdown would be ending soon. Morning was approaching. The situation outside should be resolving. I would be able to leave and go home and resume my normal life. I felt a sense of relief at this prospect. I had made it through the night. I had remained safe. Everything was going to be okay. Patricia came back on the public address system at 6:30 a.m. She said that the security team and the police were assessing whether the area was clear enough to lift the lockdown. She said we should remain in the building for a while longer, that there would be another update soon. She said everyone had done great, staying calm and following the emergency procedures. She said we were almost through this. I felt encouraged by this announcement. We were almost through this. The lockdown would be lifted soon. I would be able to go home. By 7 a.m., people in the office were starting to move around more actively. Some people were gathering their things, preparing to leave as soon as the lockdown was lifted. Some people were going to the break room to get coffee and food. The office felt like it was waking up, getting ready for the day. But at 7:15 a.m., something changed. Patricia came back on the public address system, and her voice was different. She sounded tense. She said there was a problem. She said the police had determined that the area outside the building was not clear. We knew that there was still a significant threat in the immediate vicinity, and that the lockdown was going to remain in effect. She said we needed to return to our secure areas and remain calm. There was a pause after her announcement, and then people started to react. People were asking each other questions. People were becoming anxious. People were expressing frustration that the lockdown wasn't ending as expected. I felt my own anxiety increasing. I thought the lockdown was ending. I thought we would be able to leave. Now we were being told we had to stay longer. I didn't know how much longer. This uncertainty was creating a sense of unease in me. I tried to call my wife to tell her about the extended lockdown, but the call didn't go through. I tried again. The call dropped. I tried sending a text message instead, wherein the message said it couldn't be delivered. I tried again. Same result. My phone seemed to have lost connection to the cellular network. I looked around the office and saw that other people were also having the same problem. Jennifer was trying to make a call and was getting nothing. Another colleague was trying to send a text and having it fail. It seemed like the cellular network in this area had been shut down or was experiencing some kind of outage. This was when my first real moment of concern crystallized. The lockdown was still in effect. I couldn't communicate with my wife. I didn't know how long I would be here. And the situation outside was apparently serious enough that it wasn't being resolved as expected. Patricia came back on the public address system and said that cellular service in the area had been intentionally shut down as part of the emergency response. She said this was normal protocol during certain types of public health emergencies. She said we shouldn't worry about the lack of cellular service. She said we could use the building's landline system to make calls if needed. She said everything was under control. but everything didn't feel under control. The situation felt like it was being managed in real time, which suggested that the managers didn't actually know what was going to happen next. They were responding to developments as they occurred, not executing a predetermined plan. I used one of the office landlines to call my wife. When she answered, I could hear the concern in her voice immediately. I told her I was locked in the building, that the lockdown had been extended, that I didn't know when I would be able to leave. She said she was frightened about the situation outside, that she'd been watching the news, and that it seemed serious. I told her I was safe inside the building, that there was no danger here, and that I would call her as soon as I knew more. We talked for a few minutes, and then I told her I needed to go. I hung up the phone feeling even more anxious than I had before. Hearing the fear in my wife's voice had made the situation feel more real. This wasn't just a temporary lockdown. This was a serious outbreak happening in the city. And I was locked in a building, separated from my wife, unable to leave, uncertain about when this would end. By 8 a.m., when the group of us still in the building had settled into a different kind of waiting. The initial sense of temporary inconvenience had shifted to something more like resignation. We were going to be here for at least another day, possibly longer. We needed to accept this and figure out how to pass the time. People gathered in the break room and the main office areas. The company catering service had been called, and there was food available. There was coffee and water. There were bathrooms with supplies. The building was habitable for an extended period. We could survive being locked in here for days if necessary, but around 9 a.m., there was an incident that changed the dynamic of the situation. One of the colleagues, a man named Robert, who worked in the sales department, started banging on the front glass doors of the building. He was trying to force them open. He was saying that he needed to leave, that the lockdown was unlawful, that he wasn't going to stay locked in this building. David, the security guard, went to him and tried to calm him down. They had a conversation. Robert was becoming increasingly agitated. He was demanding that the doors be unlocked. He was saying that the situation outside wasn't as dangerous as they were claiming. He was saying that staying in the building was the real danger. Patricia came down from the administrative areas and joined David in trying to calm Robert. She tried to explain that the police and the emergency management authorities had determined that the lockdown was necessary for our safety. She tried to explain that forcing open the doors would compromise the security of the entire building. She tried to reason with him. But Robert was beyond reasoning. He was panicked, and panic wasn't rational. He continued to bang on the doors, and he began to try to break the glass. David and Patricia eventually had to physically restrain him and move him to a back office where he could calm down. This incident had a profound effect on everyone in the building. It showed that the lockdown was creating psychological stress. It showed that not everyone was accepting the situation calmly. It showed that people were becoming desperate to leave. And it also revealed something else. The doors were locked from the inside as well as from the outside. Robert's attempt to force them open had made this clear. We weren't just locked in because the police had locked the outside doors. We were locked in because the building's security system was preventing the doors from being opened from the inside. This realization created a shift in my perception of the situation. This wasn't just about containing danger from outside. This was about containing us. We were locked in, and we were going to stay locked in until someone decided to let us out. Around 10:30 a.m., Patricia made another announcement. She said that the police had advised that the lockdown would continue through the day and would be reassessed in the evening. She said we should make ourselves as comfortable as possible. She said the building would remain secure and we would all be safe. But the reassurance felt hollow now. We were locked in a building. The doors wouldn't open, we couldn't leave, and we didn't have any certainty about when that would change. I spent the next hours sitting at my desk, trying to pass the time. I read emails, I browsed the internet using the building's Wi-Fi. I tried not to think about the situation outside or about how long I was going to be stuck here. I tried to focus on neutral, calming things. But I found myself increasingly aware of the minutes passing. I became aware of how different the office felt when it wasn't a work environment. The same desks and computers and office furniture that had been normal and familiar were now starting to feel like a confining space. The office building, which I had thought of as a safe, secure place, was now starting to feel like a cage. Around 2 p.m., I decided to take a walk through the building. I went up the stairs to the upper floors, exploring areas I didn't normally go to. And I found the company's executive offices on the 4th floor. I found storage areas. I found a roof access door that was locked. I went back down to my floor feeling like I had done some kind of reconnaissance, though I wasn't sure what I was trying to accomplish. When I returned to the main office area, I found that the mood had shifted again. People were becoming more openly anxious. Some people were on the landlines trying to reach family members and loved ones. Some people were trying to find ways to get more information about what was happening outside. Some people were becoming angry at the situation, frustrated that we were still locked in, frustrated that there was no clear timeline for when we would be released. Around 4 p.m., I checked my notebook where I'd written my 3 goals for the day. 1, just reduce my average call handle time to under 7 minutes. 2, complete the training module on the new software update. 3, maintain a customer satisfaction rating above 90%. These goals seemed absurdly irrelevant now. I was locked in an office building with dozens of other people, unable to leave, uncertain about when I would be able to go home. Patricia came on the public address system again at 5 p.m. She said that the situation outside had not improved. She said that the police had advised that the lockdown would continue through the night. She said we should try to make ourselves as comfortable as possible for what was likely going to be another night in the building. She said there would be another update in the morning. Another night. I was going to have to stay here for another night. This had moved beyond a temporary inconvenience. This was becoming a significant disruption to my life. I was missing work from home. My wife was alone and frightened. My routine was disrupted. My sense of control over my situation was being eroded with each passing hour. I tried to sleep that night, but it was much harder than it had been the previous night. I was anxious, I was uncomfortable. My mind was racing with thoughts about what was happening outside, about when I would be able to leave, about what I was missing at home. Around midnight, I gave up trying to sleep. I went to the break room and made coffee, even though I knew it would probably keep me awake. I sat at a table and drank the coffee and thought about the situation. This is when I realized something that created my second real moment of concern. I realized that I was starting to lose track of time. I had been in this building for approximately 24 hours now. I wasn't sure how many hours exactly. I had slept twice, or maybe I hadn't slept much the second time. I wasn't sure. The lack of natural day-night rhythm in the interior of the office building was making it hard for me to maintain a clear sense of how much time had passed. and I realized that I was starting to lose the ability to predict when this would end. When I first arrived, I'd assumed I would leave at the end of my shift. When the lockdown was implemented, I had assumed I would leave in the morning. When morning came and the lockdown continued, I had assumed I would leave by evening. Now evening had come, and the lockdown was still in effect, and I no longer had any framework for predicting when it would end. This uncertainty was creating a psychological state that was different from simple anxiety. It was a kind of surrender to the unknown. It was an acceptance that I didn't control when I would leave this building. That control was in the hands of the police, the emergency management authorities, whoever was deciding when the outside situation was safe enough for the lockdown to be lifted. Around 1 a.m., on what was now the third day of my being in the building, David, the security guard, came to find me in the break room. He looked even more tired than he had before. He asked if I wanted to go to the security office with him. He said he wanted to talk to someone about something, and he thought I might be trustworthy to talk to. I agreed, and I followed him to the security office. Once we were inside, David closed the door and sat down heavily in a chair. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something that changed my understanding of the situation. He said that the police and the emergency management authorities had not actually told the building management when the lockdown would end. He said that Patricia had been asking for updates, asking for a timeline, asking when we would be able to let people out. He said the police had been giving vague responses, saying only that the situation was still developing, that the area was not yet secure, that they would provide an update soon. He said Patricia was becoming increasingly concerned that they didn't actually have a plan for when the lockdown would end. He said that the police had instructed the building management to maintain strict lockdown procedures and to keep the doors locked until they received explicit authorization to open them. He said that the exterior doors were being monitored by police and that no one was going to be permitted to leave until the police gave the order. He said that based on what he was hearing from the police liaisons, he didn't think the lockdown was going to end soon. He said he thought we might be here for days. He said that if anyone asked him, he would tell them that we needed to prepare for an extended lockdown, not a temporary one. This conversation crystallized something in my mind. I wasn't locked in this building because of a temporary emergency situation. I was locked in because the situation outside was serious and ongoing. I was going to be here for an extended period. I needed to accept this and adapt to it. I thanked David for telling me this, and I returned to the main office area. It was around 2 a.m., and most people were sleeping in various areas of the building. I found a relatively quiet spot and tried to rest, though I wasn't able to sleep. The next morning, around 8 a.m., Patricia made an announcement. She said that the building management and the police had agreed to implement a more sustainable schedule for managing the extended lockdown. She said that we would be staying in the building for an indefinite period and that we needed to organize ourselves in a way that would allow for everyone's needs to be met. She said she was setting up work schedules for people to help manage food distribution, sanitation, security monitoring, hedgers, and other necessary functions. She said the company would be continuing to pay salaries for the duration of the lockdown and that everyone would be expected to contribute to the functioning of the building community. This announcement was the moment when I fully accepted the reality of the situation. I was not going to leave this building today. I was not going to leave tomorrow. I was going to be here for an indeterminate period. possibly weeks, possibly longer, until the situation outside was resolved. I felt a kind of resignation settle over me. Not acceptance exactly, but a kind of surrender to the reality of the situation. I was trapped. I was going to have to make the best of being trapped. I volunteered for one of the work schedules. I was assigned to help with food distribution and meal preparation. I was given a list of other people who would be working on the same schedule. I was told when my shifts would start and when they would end. Over the next week, I developed a routine. I helped prepare meals in the company cafeteria. I distributed food to the people in the building. I spent time cleaning and maintaining the common areas. I spent time in the office areas when I wasn't working. I slept in different locations depending on what was available. The people in the building were adapting to the extended lockdown in different ways. Some people were taking it in stride, treating it like a kind of extended team building experience. Some people were becoming increasingly anxious and frustrated. Some people seemed to be withdrawing psychologically, becoming quiet and isolated. Around a week into the lockdown, I began to notice something disturbing. I had lost track of what day it was. I had lost my clear sense of time. The lack of daylight in the interior of the building, the disruption of my normal sleep schedule, the repetition of similar activities made each day feel the same. I wasn't sure if I'd been in the building for 7 days or 10 days or more. I was losing the ability to track the passage of time. Around 10 days into the lockdown, I was speaking with Jennifer, and she mentioned something that struck me as deeply disturbing. She said that she was no longer sure if the lockdown was real. She said that the situation outside might not actually be as serious as we'd been told. She said that maybe the police were keeping us here for some other reason. She said that maybe we were being held here for a purpose that we didn't understand. And I told her that her thinking was becoming paranoid, that we had clear evidence that something serious was happening outside. But even as I said it, I realized that I wasn't actually certain of this. I was taking it on faith that what Patricia had told us about the situation outside was true. I didn't actually have direct evidence. I hadn't seen the outbreak. I hadn't seen the danger. I only had the word of the building management and the police that the danger existed. This realization created a profound uncertainty in my mind. What if Jennifer was right? What if we were being held here for a reason that we didn't understand? What if the lockdown wasn't about protecting us from something outside, but about containing us for some other purpose? I found myself spiraling into a kind of paranoid thinking, deeks which I recognized as paranoid even as I was thinking it. I knew that I was probably being irrational, but I couldn't stop my mind from going to these dark places. Around 2 weeks into the lockdown, I made a decision. I decided that I needed to find out the truth about what was happening outside. I decided that I needed to try to get out of the building, to see what was actually out there, to determine whether the threat was real or whether we were being held for some other reason. I knew that the exterior doors were locked and monitored by police. I knew that trying to force them open would result in confrontation with security and law enforcement. But I also knew that I couldn't continue to exist in this state of uncertainty. I needed to know. I waited until late at night, around 2 a.m., when most people were sleeping. I made my way to the basement level of the building, an area I'd explored briefly during the lockdown. I had discovered that there was a maintenance area in the basement that had a window facing outward. It was a small window, barely large enough to see through, but it looked out at ground level to the area outside the building. I looked through this window and I saw the parking lot outside. I saw the street lights. I saw nothing unusual. The parking lot was empty. The area was quiet. There was no sign of danger. There was no sign of outbreak. No sign of infected people. No sign of anything that would justify the lockdown. This is when everything I'd believed about the situation outside shattered. If there was truly a serious outbreak happening, I should have been able to see evidence of it from this window. I should have been able to see emergency vehicles or police presence or visible danger of some kind. But I saw nothing. The area outside looked completely normal. It looked like a normal night in a normal parking lot. I felt a surge of panic and anger. If there was no visible danger outside, then why were we locked in? Why were we being kept here? What was the actual reason for the lockdown? I made a decision. I was going to try to get out. I was going to force open one of the doors. I was going to see what was actually outside. I went to the lowest level of the building, to an exit door that I knew was there. I tried to force it open. The door was locked electronically. I couldn't force it open without making noise that would alert the security team. I went back upstairs and found David in the security office. I told him what I had seen, or rather what I hadn't seen. I told him that I looked out the basement window and I didn't see any sign of danger or outbreak outside. I asked him what was actually happening. I asked him why we were still locked in if there was no visible threat. David looked at me with an expression of profound weariness. He said, "Marcus, the doors aren't locked to keep you in. They're locked to keep you in because someone wants you to stay here. When someone wants you to leave, they'll unlock the doors." I asked him what he meant. He said he'd already said too much. He said he couldn't tell me anymore. He said I should go back to my sleeping area and try to rest. I pressed him further. I asked him if he knew what was actually happening outside. I asked him if the outbreak was real or if it was something else. Or he looked at me for a long moment and then he said, "It's real. The outbreak is real. But what happens inside this building isn't about protecting you from the outbreak. It's about managing you. It's about keeping you functioning and compliant while you're here. When the time is right, they'll let you out. Until then, you stay." I asked him who they were. He said he didn't know. He said that above Patricia, there were other authorities, other people making decisions. He said the lockdown was part of something larger, something he didn't understand. This conversation left me deeply disturbed. David was saying something that suggested that the lockdown had a purpose beyond the stated emergency management rationale. He was suggesting that we were being held here for reasons that had nothing to do with the outbreak outside. I spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety and suspicion. I started observing the building management more carefully. I started noticing details that I had previously overlooked. I noticed that the food distribution seemed carefully calculated. I noticed that people's movements were being subtly monitored. I noticed that Patricia seemed to be receiving instructions through phone calls or communications that she didn't share with the rest of us. I asked to speak with Patricia directly. I told her that I was concerned about how long the lockdown was lasting. I asked her what the police had said about when it would end. She gave me vague responses, the same kind of vague responses that David had mentioned the police giving to her. She said that the situation outside was still being assessed. She said that the lockdown would end when it was safe. She said I should try to be patient. Around 3 weeks into the lockdown, I made another decision. I decided that I was going to try to communicate with the outside world. I was going to try to make contact with someone outside the building who could tell me what was actually happening. I found a landline phone in one of the empty offices and I tried to make a call. The phone worked, but when I tried to dial, I discovered that the building's phone lines were being routed through a restricted system. I couldn't dial any number outside of the pre-approved list of numbers that had been provided to us. All outgoing calls were being monitored and controlled. I tried to access the internet using the building's Wi-Fi, but I discovered that the network had been configured to prevent access to external websites. Only approved company websites and news feeds were accessible. I couldn't get information from the broader internet. All information I had access to was being filtered through the building's network. I realized then that we were not just locked in physically, we were also locked in informationally. We had no way to independently verify what was happening outside. We had no way to communicate with the outside world except through the channels that the building management controlled. We were trapped in a carefully constructed information environment. This realization brought me to a critical point in my understanding of the situation. I was no longer just locked in a building during an emergency. I was being held in a controlled environment where my perception of reality was being managed. I was being held for a purpose that I didn't understand by authorities that I couldn't identify, with no clear way to escape or to change my situation. I spent hours in a kind of paralyzed state, trying to process this realization. I felt a kind of despair that I had never experienced before. I had lost control of my situation. I had no way to escape. I had no way to change what was happening. I was trapped. And then something shifted in me. I realized that I was making a choice. I was choosing to remain trapped. I was choosing to accept the lockdown, to follow the rules, to wait for the authorities to decide what would happen to me. I had other options. I could attempt to escape. I could attempt to break through the barriers that were keeping me confined. I could take actions that had consequences. It was around 10:30 p.m. on what I calculated to be the 23rd day of the lockdown when I made my decision. I was going to try to leave the building. I was going to attempt to break through the security system and open a door and get out. I knew this would be dangerous. I knew there would be consequences, but I also knew that staying here, remaining trapped, accepting this situation was destroying me psychologically. I couldn't continue to exist in this state of captivity. I gathered a few colleagues who I thought might be willing to help. I explained to them what I had discovered, what I believed was happening, and what I wanted to do. I asked them if they would help me try to escape. To my surprise, they agreed. Or at least, some of them agreed. There were 3 of us willing to try. The other people in the building were either too afraid, too compliant, or too convinced of the official narrative to want to try. We made a plan. We were going to go to one of the exterior doors at a time when the security presence was likely to be at its minimum. We were going to attempt to force the door open. We were going to get out of the building and see what was actually outside. The opportunity came around 2 a.m. on day 24 of the lockdown. The security office appeared to be relatively quiet. David was alone. The other security personnel seemed to be in other areas of the building. We went to the nearest exterior door. One of my colleagues had found a pry bar in the maintenance area. We began to attempt to force the door open. The electronic lock resisted. We pushed harder. The door suddenly gave way. It opened. We saw the outside. We saw the parking lot lit by streetlights, empty and quiet. And we saw what was actually outside the building. There was nothing there. No outbreak, no infected people, no danger. Just a quiet parking lot and the rest of the city beyond it, appearing normal. We stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind us. We stood in the parking lot and we were no longer locked in the building. We were free. I don't have a clear memory of what happened next. I remember feeling a kind of shock, a kind of disorientation. I remember the three of us looking at each other, not speaking. I remember deciding to get in one of the cars in the parking lot and to drive away from the building. The car had been left with the keys in it, which, in retrospect, seems like an unlikely coincidence. Or perhaps it was something that was left there deliberately, as if whoever had orchestrated the lockdown had wanted to facilitate our escape. I drove away from the building and I drove toward my home. As I drove, I didn't see any evidence of outbreak or emergency. The roads were empty, but they appeared normal. There were no infected people. There were no emergency vehicles or police presence. Everything appeared normal except for the absence of normal nighttime traffic. I drove home and found my wife awake, waiting for me. She was frightened and relieved to see me. She said she had been monitoring the news and the outbreak had been reported as contained. She said the emergency was supposed to be over. She said she couldn't understand why I'd still been locked in the building if the emergency was over. I didn't have an answer for her. I don't have an answer now. I'm sitting in my car in the parking lot of the Viridian Systems building and I'm writing this account. I'm waiting for someone to call me, for someone to contact me, for some, authority to demand that I return to the building or to explain what happened or to clarify what the lockdown actually was. But no one has called me. No one has attempted to contact me. The building remains behind me and I'm no longer part of it. I'm left with the knowledge that something happened that I don't fully understand. I was locked in a building for approximately 3 weeks. I was told it was for my safety during an outbreak, but the outbreak didn't appear to be real, or at least I saw no evidence of it. I was being held for reasons that I still don't understand. I don't know if the outbreak was real or if it was fabricated. I don't know if I was being held for some purpose I don't understand, or if it was all some kind of system that was designed to test how people respond to captivity. I don't know if the escape was planned or if it was actually an escape. What I do know is that I was locked in a building and then I was no longer locked in. I made a choice to attempt escape, and that choice resulted in my freedom. But I don't know if that's what was supposed to happen or if something else was supposed to happen or if everything that occurred was exactly as it was meant to occur from the beginning. And the thing that disturbs me most is that I don't know if I'll ever see the answer to these questions. I don't know if anyone will ever explain to me what actually happened. I'm left in a state of permanent uncertainty, understanding that I was held captive, understanding that I escaped, but not understanding the purpose or the meaning of any of it. And I'm left wondering if everyone else is still inside that building, still locked in, still believing the official narrative about the outbreak, or if they've also figured it out, or if they're content to remain locked in, accepting what they've been told, waiting for the time when they're released. I don't have an answer to that question either.